everyone, and welcome to our FCI Live 2025 series. We're excited to have you here. This is our second day of the series. It's a 2-week series, so this is week one. We will have a whole second set of sessions next week, Monday through Thursday. And we have a topic that a lot of you have requested, but we'll go into more in just a moment, but exploring the multi-stakeholder model. Hopefully that's what you're here for. Before we get started with that, real quick, I want to thank our FCI Live champion sponsors, National Co-op Grocers, .coop, and Colluminate, who are making this series possible. Thank you so much, guys. So, real quick, I want to say again, we've gotten tons of requests for this topic. And we decided we wanted to go to the source. We wanted to go to the professionals. Startup food co-ops, there's different ways you can structure ownership. The vast majority of food co-ops today are consumer owned. That means those that shop with the co-op are the ones who own it. It is the easiest structure, especially to set up as a startup. Because one of it's not nearly as common, but the other structure we do often do see with some food co-ops is sometimes called the multi-stakeholder, the solidarity model. It means the consumers own it, as do the workers. And when you don't have workers, it's a little tough to open a startup that is both worker and consumer owned. And some startups are starting to do it. Actually, the first that has opened with that structure and model and been able to launch the worker shares is Gem City Market in Dayton, Ohio, and they just got that done this year. So congratulations to them. But what we've done is like, you know what? Since startups are still trying to do this is something that really aligns with a lot of startups' values. Let's talk to the source. Let's talk to somebody who has both been in the leadership team operationally and the board president of a food cooperative that has successfully been running as a multi-stakeholder co-op for decades. And so with that, I'm going to introduce you to Allanah Hines. Thanks so much for being here, Allanah.
Of course, thank you. So I want to, oh, I see it's open. All right. Are you able to see my screen? Fantastic. Okay. Thank you everybody for being here and for joining this conversation. I will say I always love to have this conversation because I do get so many requests off to the side. So I'll go to a conference and people will ask kind of how does this work? What's going on? How are you doing this multi-stakeholder model? So I'm essentially going to share the case study of Weaver Street Market. I welcome questions because it's a lot. It's one thing to just say we're going to open a co-op. It's another thing to say, well, how do we decide how we're going to divide it up? It is difficult. So if you've been a part of any of the FCI Live series, I will say one of the things that I love the most about them is they're very honest and they're very real. So they're from the people that are doing the work. And so I'll start. I'll start with a little bit about myself. My name is Allanah Hines. I title myself, I'm a community food strategist, a thought leader in food systems. I'm currently an independent consultant with both in and out of cooperatives. So I work with operations, I work with boards of governance, with my focus essentially being on strategic community food systems and strengthening those systems. So one of the things that I absolutely love to do is I love to speak on my experience because I was with Weaver Street for so long. And then I still live right down the street. So I'm super excited. With me and Weaver Street. So I did work at Weaver Street for 17 years as a worker owner. So I was there for a very, very long time. And now I'm a consumer owner. I was also on the board of directors for 4 of those years. And I was the board chair for 3 of those years. So quite a long time. And hopefully this is very helpful to a lot of people. And as JQ said, I welcome questions because this is a lot to handle. So we're going to start initially with who is Weaver Street Market? Being here, I take for granted the fact that everybody usually knows in Central North Carolina when it comes to co-op world, but Weaver Street Market is located in Central North Carolina. It's actually the largest retail grocery co-op in the Southeast. So if you haven't already been, please come. I will personally show you around. It's one of my favorite things to do because as a cooperator opening a food co-op, you likely love food. So Weaver Street has 4 locations and 1 food house, which is where it has a commissary kitchen, a bread bakery, and a pastry bakery. It was incorporated in 1987 and doors opened in 1988. So this year, Weaver Street is actually 38 years old. And the study, kind of the case study of it, is that it is an anomaly because it is a hybrid ownership model. So, as I said, Weaver Street does have worker owners and it has consumer owners, and it started that way. Other co ops essentially looked over and said, "What are y'all doing? That seems hard." It was, but it's worked and it's held through 40 years. So, I'm going to take it back a couple steps and just start with what is ownership? So, as you're moving forward just in startup land, and what exactly is it and why is it important even at all? Your ownership is really it's where your owners, where your community is saying, we're going to put some stock in this co-op. We're doing what we say that we're going to do. It's equity in this community focus. And then it's also, you're talking about the base equity of your co-op. So it's your owner capital. Ownership, typically the standard benefits, you get a profit dividend. So when your co-op deems a profit, then it's divided amongst its owner. You also get voting rights. So one member, one vote. You will oftentimes hear that when people talk about co-op principles, one member, one vote. And then you also have the ability to serve on the board of directors. Oftentimes also, co-ops will have additional benefits. Most of it, I think, depends on your capacity and also your financial readiness. So you may have some owner rewards, some owner discounts, just different benefits that you just kind of create, but it also really depends on what does your community want? So not every community wants the exact same thing. You build it around what people are asking for. So when we talk about different types of co-ops, just in general, so across industries, your co-op types, you have worker co-ops, producer co-ops, processing co-ops, consumer co-ops, farmer co-ops, purchasing co-ops, hybrid. There's so many types of co-ops. Essentially, what we're doing here and the models that we're pulling together here are we're talking about consumer co-ops where it's owned by the consumers and their buy-in is the dollars spent in your co-op. You're also talking about your workers. Their labor, their buy-in is their labor. So when we're talking about a hybrid co-op, we're talking about consumers and workers, where your buy-in is your dollars spent and your buy-in is your labor in the co-op. So what does this look like? That's where we're going to bring in Weaver Street Market. I will put in the disclaimer, and I can't say it enough. You have to do what works for your community and you have to do what works for your economics. So exactly as JQ said, some people can start and say, okay, we're going to start with worker owners and we're going to start with consumer owners. Sometimes you just kind of need to get those doors open. So it does contribute to your base equity, but as I go through, we're also going to go more into what's the cost of it, what's the benefit of it. And as you already know, likely if you're in the startup phase, a lot of it is the education. So when you're saying you're not just going to work here, but you're going to buy into what the co-op is doing, you own a portion of this business. You have to really engage your audience. You have to engage your workers. So when you're talking about we're going to have this hybrid model, you're not only engaging your community that's going to come and shop those shelves, but you're also engaging your workers that are going to come in and you're saying, so not only are you working here, but you own a business. So I will say when Weaver Street Market opened, one of the goals, one of the initial goals, and I know this because I had a lot of conversations with Ruffin for about 3 years and saying, why did you choose something so difficult? I mean, it's hard enough to just open a co-op, but why did you want something hybrid? And it was very plain and simple when he explained it. He essentially said, I wanted to build something for the community. At the time, 40 years ago, he was already working in cooperatives. He really knew the model. And for him, he said the community was more than just the people that were coming and shopping there, because I knew that we had a large audience that was really willing to support our efforts. A lot of big box grocery stores were coming and we didn't know where our food was coming from. And we were a generation where your food was essentially right down the street, but now there's the store and you're not sure where it is. Like it's got these labels, but you have no idea where it is. But when we thought community, we also wanted to instill that sense of power for our workers. We wanted people to come in and say, I own this place, because when you own something, you just feel a little more included. So that was really important for him and for the other organizers that were putting together Weaver Street. So what does this look like? And I'll say, things change. 40 years ago is much different from today. So in 1988, consumer ownership for Weaver Street Market looked just a little different. Oops. In 1988, a worker ownership, or no, a consumer owner, I'm sorry, a consumer owner was sold to households based on the number of adults. So for one adult in the household, it was $75. For two, it was $135. And then for three, it was $175. Other things that you received in 1988 with the consumer ownership was you received product discounts, grocery delivery for seniors, discounts with partner businesses. So I will say, I know when I started almost 20 years ago, one of the things that I loved was that you got at one of the local movie theaters, you got a free ticket for any movie except you couldn't be there on the opening day, which I don't know if it got me to work there, but I was really excited about it. You also got discounts for volunteering. You got opportunities to vote for and serve on the board of directors. And then you also got profit dividends because it was a co-op at the end of the day. In 1988, for worker ownership, it was sold after 90 days of performance. And it was upon the vote of other worker owners. It was $400. And with that, you received an involvement in the store decision making, opportunities to vote for and serve on the board of directors, and you also got profit dividends. So a buy-in that was useful. Most of the workers at the time of opening did decide to lean into worker ownership because they understood the model and they understood the importance of having a community co-op in the area where you're not just feeling good about the products that you're selling, but you're also feeling good about the partnerships that you have and you really enjoy your coworkers. So as times change, so did ownership. I will say, sitting in on every other FCI Live series that I have, yesterday especially, and I think Sam said it at least 3 times, it's very important to pivot as necessary. So in 40 years, so many things have changed, and I would definitely stress the importance of making sure that as things change, I mean, things now don't cost as much as they did 40 years ago, and you often also have many different generations that are now shopping there. So although the locations have changed, Weaver Street started with just one store. It's now 4 stores. So with all of the stores that are a part of Weaver Street Market and over 250 employees, which is not what it started with, things have changed. So in 2025, consumer ownership is sold to households, no longer depending on the number of adults. A consumer ownership is $75. It's a flat fee. And a couple other really cool things about consumer ownership now. You can also gift a consumer ownership. That was not doable 40 years ago. Maybe because they didn't think about it, maybe they thought about it and weren't quite sure how it worked. But as things changed and as people bought into the co-op initially and then moved away, they said, well, but my child is still there or my neighbors are really there. And I really want to make sure that other people can enjoy the co-op the way that I did. So you can gift community ownership. And then we also have a free food for all ownership. So food for all within Weaver Street Market, it's an ownership for people that are on federal assistance programs. So it wasn't built in 40 years ago, but about 5 years ago, when essentially Weaver Street said, wait a minute, we're missing some people. We know that everybody should be shopping here at the co-op, and really sending out a few community surveys, we very quickly and readily heard we would shop there, but it's really expensive, or maybe it's just not where we feel like we belong. So marketing, merchandising, and the board essentially said, what can we do? How can we financially make it feasible that essentially if you're on these federal nutrition programs that you can also shop at the co-op? So didn't start there, but it's now a consumer ownership model. Now, within community ownerships or consumer ownerships, sorry, I keep messing that up. But within consumer ownerships, you also get the product discounts, which are now called owner rewards. You also get an eligibility within the local credit union. So I don't know about anybody else, but to me, the credit union sometimes a little hard to get into. Oftentimes, I know that one of the main ones here, it's easy if you're a teacher or if you're a public worker, which I wasn't. But it's helpful because now it's essentially the partnership between the co-ops. You still have the opportunity to vote for and serve on the board of directors, and you also get profit dividends. 2025 worker ownership, still after 90 days of performance, because, well, we have to know that you're going to be a worker. It's no longer $400, but it is $500. Over 40 years, okay, inflation looks like it handled pretty well. Within that also, you, oops, sorry. You can also, so this also continues to get you the involvement in the board or in the store decisions alongside an admin department. So 40 years later, essentially Weaver Street has built out a large admin department that has your merchandising, it has your marketing, it has your HR, things like that. So still that involvement, you get the eligibility with the local credit union as well. You also do receive those product discounts and those owner rewards because you are an owner. You have the opportunity to vote for and serve on the board, and you also get those profit dividends. Another cool thing that both ownership classes get, as I said, as you pivot, as you learn more, when you sign up to be an owner of Weaver Street Market, whether it's a worker owner or a consumer owner, you also get 7 weeks of owner incentives. It's kind of made up, but it gets people really excited. Now you're pumped up to be a part of the co-op. So this includes things like a discount to the hot bar and salad bar. You also get, I think we got a coupon for a mini pie, which is from our bakery and Fantastic. And you also get a free t-shirt.
Alana, there was a question, I think, about what is the makeup on the board. So when you as a worker are voting you can serve on the board. How many seats of the board belong to the workers versus the consumers?
I'm so glad you asked. So wait, there's more. So, super important question because essentially what we're talking about, what we've spoken of so far, is the hybrid ownership and how that looks within operations and getting everybody on board, getting your consumers, getting your workers to say, yes, this is going to be what I do. But within Weaver Street Market, there's also representation on the board. So this is also something that I say quite often, and every board is different. So how your representation appears on the board, some people's general managers are or not. Within Weaver Street Market, there are 7 board seats. 2 of those are elected consumer owners. 2 of those are elected worker owners. 2 of those are appointed directors. And then 1 of those is the general manager. Something very different about Weaver Street Market, even with the worker owners on the board, worker owners are able to have the leadership roles as well. So when I say I was a worker owner, I was also the board chair. Those are not forbidden for worker owners. So it's for your worker owners and your consumer owners. So your worker owner, it's a dynamic, I will say. I oftentimes get the question, how does that work? That feels kind of sticky. To be honest, that relationship is held together by bylaws, policy, and human kindness, quite simply. We're all there for the same reason. We know why we're there. It's not after a long, hard day, the last thing that you want to do is to kind of have infighting or anything like that. But you also understand what it does within the board as well is it creates a very unique environment. So it's not just saying, yes, I'm here, but your vote is on the board. It's not just we have workers up here and we hear it, but we're really not sure how we're going to incorporate it. And then it also helps a lot of times because the workers are able to stand in the gap. So a lot of times your consumers can walk through your stores and maybe they have additional expertise, maybe on the project that your board is working on at the time. But your workers, what I found, we were often able to say, well, this feels really great, but the workers don't understand it. Or, how are we going to make sure that the people in the stores right now, especially during times like COVID, when we're saying, how are we going to communicate these things? We want to do a survey and the workers are saying, well, that feels great, but the workers are actually pretty scared. How are we doing this? So having all of those dynamics on the board And it also helps to bridge that relationship between the general manager and your workers. So if you haven't already heard, that relationship is so key. It is so important. So it removes a lot of that fear. You're working alongside your general manager, you're working alongside your consumer owners. And so you're hearing both inside and outside. So yeah, hopefully that answered the question about the board.
That was a phenomenal point about that. I really love how you approached that. There was a question. It is very unusual. I didn't know this either, to see appointed board members for a food co-op. Who appoints them? That was the question.
Yeah. So there's an appointment process. I'll say in the years that I was on the board, we essentially had committees. What we found was most helpful. So in my, I would say I took one pretty heavy 4 years on the board. In my time, we were coming out of COVID, so we're working that financial. We also had GM succession and that process. But essentially through that, the board kind of put the word out. So there's a call for candidates that we initially put out. We review the documentation to make sure it's what we want. So, we make sure that it's very honest. We make sure that you know what you're getting in for. It's not a super working board. It's not a part-time job, but we are here because we want to move the co-op in a different direction or maybe in the same direction. We speak to how aggressive we plan to be within the next term, and the board puts a word out. So we speak to our networks, and then we also ask our consumers and our workers, who do you know who might be interested in this? So depending on the process, the election is essentially, it's you write your portion and then you have it up and everybody puts their ballot in the box for you. But the appointed membership is actually, it's a bit different when you add it to the board. So those people don't go through the elections process, and essentially the board comes and holds interviews. The board holds essentially a matrix and saying, what do we need right now? So we need a bit of a different board member once COVID shut down our hot bars and salad bars, and you're looking at the portion of profits that takes up. You need a different type of board member when you are hiring a new GM. You need a different type of board member when you're considering opening another store, maybe a partnership with another co-op. So it essentially, it's a web of people. Throughout the year, the board works together, both the consumers and the workers, in trying to keep the network open. So if you've ever been on a co-op board, it's usually not a huge audience that attends every time. So really keeping people engaged. And throughout the year, people kind of fell into our laps quite often and said, okay, I've been coming to your meetings. I'm hearing what you're working on. How can I become more involved? And we say, hey, you know what? We're actually about to appoint another member. Maybe this is something you can add to.
Makes good. I would say, and it's unusual. I've seen before the board does the appointing, and I can see the reasoning behind it. There was real quick. There was a question in the chat about if you've ever seen producer consumer ownership, and I'll just say real quick. Lots of startups have started with this concept, even written to their bylaws. We've never seen anyone open with it, and I do not know of any open co-ops that have it because producers again and again will say, "I don't have time to serve on your board. As long as you're doing right by us, we're good." And I've just seen this everywhere. So we haven't seen it. I have just heard of my first ever producer-owned food co-op, a very small food co-op. It's a farm stop model. But no, producers generally are not really interested in the hybrid model. A lot of us have tried. I'm just gonna leave it there and let Alana get back to her topic with the worker. I'm hybrid.
Well, and I'm glad you went there because, kind of to round it up, that's the reason that I share this. So in my time in the board, this was maybe about 3 or so years ago, we did have some vendors come to the board and say, have you considered having a board consideration for a vendor ownership? So a producer ownership within Weaver Street Market. At the time, we didn't quite have the capacity. Like I said, we were coming out of COVID, and we were also dealing with, how can we keep the board together and move forward as far as hiring a new GM? But it is something that I will say comes up every so often. The main kind of reasons that we were hearing was essentially, especially during COVID when prices were just soaring and people are realizing that co-op was not running out of essentials quite the way that a lot of big box stores were, because we were working with local producers down the street. And so producers were essentially saying, well, if we could just get a larger discount, essentially, if we could come in, if we're shorted something and we can come into the co-op and we can buy in bulk, that would actually be fantastic. after more conversation and really thinking, because like I said, when we're looking at a hybrid model, we're looking at our consumers and we're looking at our workers. So we're thinking, what would be the buy-in? So, we know, yes, it would be your dollars, but also it would be, do you have the capacity to be on the board? Because that would rearrange these seats, increase the board. But also if the end goal in hearing this, because it's important to listen to your community, if the end goal is that we can provide you a discount, would it not be beneficial to set up a wholesale order? Because we only have a certain amount of product on our shelves at any given time anyway. So coming in and buying everything off of our shelf, that's not that's not in the ownership model category. Instead, what we can do is we can set up wholesale, and let's actually look at what we can do for discounts for vendors. So it has come up. I'll say it comes up every so often. I know that there are some other co-ops, I believe in North Carolina, that are considering some producer classes in their governance and in their ownership models. But yeah, I'll say through what we found, one of the things, even throughout the years, through the 40 years of Weaver Street Market, it does ebb and flow. So Weaver Street does have over 250 employees, but they've got about 150 worker owners. So not 100% worker ownership, and it's for different reasons. Some people feel that it's cost prohibitive, although you can take it out of your check. You can set up different payment plans, things like that. Some people just don't find it necessary, which is absolutely fine as well. It's absolutely no barrier to working at the co-op. But it's also, with that, Weaver Street has over 21,000 shopping consumer owners. And I say that very intentionally because at first I was like, wow, you've got a lot of consumer owners. Some people buy in and don't shop there. With any co-op, it's important that once the doors are open, you have those repeat shoppers. So I share this essentially because this is your owner equity. You do have equity coming from your worker owners as well as your consumer owners. And so even though Weaver Street has been approached in the past, and it doesn't mean that things won't change, and knowing that co-ops are considering this, I invite people to reach out. I invite people to ask questions because it has stuck around for so long and it has worked. As with anything else, you have your ebbs and flows, but I encourage it because I love sharing the model and I think it's super helpful. So I'm going to hang out there and see if there are any questions.
I wanted to highlight something you just said. People, please do throw questions in the chat. We're going to open up the floor a little bit for some conversation. And if you don't have questions, I have a million that you guys have asked me that I can pass on to Alana. But go ahead and please put those in the chat. I want to highlight what you point out, which is I was kind of flipping short trying to get back to your presentation, but the reality is exactly what you said is that we've seen it, the core question about is what do producers want to get out of ownership? And what they found in every case that we approached it at my co-op, other drum gyms I've talked to is that eventually the producers said, "Oh, we don't want all that governance responsibility. We don't want to be on the board. We want to negotiate with you this way, or we want this additional benefit." And that was all workable within the current ownership model. I actually had farmers who became consumer owners and joined the board
Mm-hmm.
because they had time for a year, and then the year rarely lasts more than a year. But they found that what they wanted, they didn't want the governance part that went with it, and I think staff sometimes finds that too. And I'm waiting for folks to throw questions in the chat. But one I have for you, Alana, is you said how many seats go to who. What's so core for people, I think, understanding is that the consumers and the workers actually own this business. What percent do the workers own?
So essentially it's one person, one vote. So the same way kind of with anything, and I'll say, and tell me if I'm answering your question when I say this. A question that I oftentimes get is when you say profit dividends, what does that mean? So that's a very big, it's a wide question, and I'll explain it. Tell me if it makes sense because it feels like long division. But essentially, your co-op decides or your board states, yes, we are declaring a profit this fiscal year. Within that, the large profit bubble is divided in two between your two classes. Half of it goes to your workers and half of it goes to your consumers, your worker owners, and half goes to your consumer owners. Like bringing it back to one of the initial slides, Your worker owner dividend is distributed based on the number of hours you worked in that year, in that fiscal year. Your consumer owner dividend is broken down based on the dollars you spent, your percentage, kind of the percentage breakdown of the dollars you spent that fiscal year. So, quite often, and if you're thinking you're dividing this half amongst a little over 250 people and this half over about 21,000 people. So, your dividend may be 3 cents that's applied to your account. It's oftentimes, I'll say, in my years, it may or may not reach about $15, but as a worker owner, your dividend may reach a few $100s. So every person is still one vote. So, me as a worker owner, I don't get 2 or 3 votes. Being on the board chair, I don't get 2 or 3. Everybody's just one vote, one share. And then the way that the dividend is broken down is essentially it's divided depending on your ownership class. Does that make sense?
That is what I was getting at. Yeah. So usually I've heard it referred to as percentage of ownership. But so the workers get to vote for 2 seats and have control over 2 seats. They can vote, and then they get 50% of all profit dividends.
Yes.
Okay. That's and we've got a question
So much
here.
better.
Let's see. What are some ways that co-ops can implement stronger worker ownership knowledge and broader familiarity with that co-op model across the workforce? Oh, you've gotten to actually live this. This is a great question.
I'll say to me, that's a great question. One of the things that we pretty consistently did. So one of the previous board chairs and I are good friends in and outside of the co-op. So what we essentially did was we decided kind of our point people. So we had 5 units between the 4 stores and the food house. So we had people that were the wealth of knowledge for all of it. You're thinking essentially we're having board meetings on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. and the stores are still open. So a lot of people either don't want to come to a meeting, even if it's virtual, or they can't, or just life. People are now listening in on something and you're listening to policy governance. Not everybody's decision for a great Wednesday afternoon, but a lot of it was the constant conversation. So in all the communications, when we had a co-op newsletter that would go out to workers, we would mention something about a worker ownership. When I know within my last role as the DEI manager, I worked pretty closely with HR as well to restructure how worker ownership was described in the first 90 days. I don't know if anybody remembers their first 90 days of the job. You don't remember most of what's told to you. So nobody really remembered. You come up 2 or 3 years later and people are like, did we ever talk about that? You did? It's an option, but who really knows their options? So a lot of it was just a constant conversation, mentioning it at all the unit meetings, making sure that there was a presence. So the same way that you're reminding your community of the importance of shopping at the co-op, you're also doing that because your employees are your community. So putting up any flyers or things like that in the break rooms, making sure that people are talking, and then also equipping your worker owners, especially your worker owner board representatives, with the toolbox that they need in order to have those conversations. So those individuals are working in our stores. So when people come to them, whether you know the question or not, it's also, do you know, because people come to you about everything and they come in the middle of a shift. So, there's no good time. I'm making a latte and people are like, so like, when's the next meeting? And are we ever going to talk about the fact the hot bar lights are off? You're like, oh, so that's not board leadership, but let's talk about what is. Because essentially you have different people that are around and inviting people. I'll say most of my time, especially as a board chair, was not the time in the meetings. It was the time in the stores speaking to the employees on what do you think the board does? Because for quite a while, I think it may have gotten away from this where people essentially saw the board as this is your last place to gripe. This is where you put your super angry messages about leadership, especially, and really pulling it back. So it's an everyday, let's talk about what the board does. Let's talk about board leadership. Do you want to sit in with me? We can talk about what's going on. So it's a constant. And like I said, it ebbs and flows. So one thing that we found, especially as we've had more non-English speakers, it's been even more difficult because culturally, a lot of people are saying, well, I don't understand this thing of owning a business. Like, this doesn't really make sense. So it's also a feeling like you can communicate to people and finding a way to bridge that gap with how can I make this make sense in a way that makes sense. And also understanding that some people are still going to walk away and say, I'm not sure. I mean, this is a grocery store. Let me see. I found that a lot of people actually signed up after a year or two because they saw their return. Yeah.
That's interesting. What I'm hearing, I think, is that a lot of the responsibility for educating the staff about the option to be worker owners fell to the board and to HR. Am I hearing that correctly? Like, who took responsibility for me? I definitely heard the board, worker owners on the board took a lot of responsibility for communicating with folks. But was that like a shared responsibility, or who really kind of headed up making sure the staff was educated?
I would say, I know for me, when I was the board president, and even speaking to the past board president, we took responsibility as the worker owners on the board and as the board presidents on the board. So, in initially saying, how many people know what we're doing? When we had different events, we would have co op fairs that are board, or no, they were owner specific. So, you're specifically invited if you are a worker or a consumer owner, and you can kind of take a look around and you can see, wow, we have a lot of consumer owners. Why don't we have any worker owners here? And so it really was asking the general manager in those conversations, how many people know what the board is doing? How many people were aware of this event? How many people are aware of board work? And then what can we do? Because within that board conversation, essentially the general manager is in charge of operations. So, it could be a request of, can we see essentially what are the onboarding tools? How is it mentioned? Not getting too far into the weeds, because that's also very important too. So your board role is governance and not kind of walking through break rooms as a board director and saying, I don't see anything in here, but instead, within the board saying, where is this appearing? So when you have the annual report, where is this appearing so that both our worker owners and our consumer owners can see it? And then when you're a board representative as a worker owner, also being that spokesperson and being able to answer questions, working alongside. I'll say I worked closely with every board, I think every board representative that I served with and the previous ones. And then, kind of being that person for if you don't know, how do you answer this question? So it was a dual role in a lot of ways. Yeah.
I love something you just brought up that I want to highlight, which is you said, and I want people to hear this, that, often the Allanah saw workers joining as owners a year or two after working there. I want to compare that to the startup experience. If you're a startup food cup organizer, how many of you have told us, well, people are going to join once they can see something. They want to see it. They want to see, either it's we're starting to throw events and have really professional logos and they're starting to see us around town, or whether it's we announce a site, but they're always looking to see like, oh, I'm investing in something that's really going to like do something that I care about or is going to do something for me, right? And so it's interesting to hear you sometimes experience this from the inside, because I think it was the same experience at Gem City, is the workers needed to be there for a couple years and really see what ownership would mean and how it would benefit them before they're like, yeah, we think we want to activate this. We want to be part of this. And I just was like, anything else you wanted to speak to there about? I think there's a conflict for staff about taking on the extra work of governance and what it will or won't mean for them and if it's worth it. And I wonder if you had any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'll say that's huge. And I think I'll say you bring up a good point. A lot of people want to see what it is, but a lot of people just aren't sure how long you're going to be in a job. So at the end of the day, they're like, I don't know how long I'm going to be a cashier. I don't know how long I'm going to live. I'm not sure. This is a job right now. So once you get in there, and we oftentimes say, you don't stay in a job because the work is super great. You stay because of the people. So when you're around a lot of really good people and they're also worker owners, and you're like, you know what? Yeah, I think I could do this. A lot of, I'll say a lot of my time, especially when it came to election time, was really one, yes, you put the word out for who wants to serve on the board, but it's looking for those people and saying, I see that you seem really interested in this work. Tell me what you see. Tell me what you think. A lot of times, exactly as Jake, you said, people said, I don't know if I have time. I feel like y'all do a lot. So, a lot of it, it's like with any job, you've got 40 hours and some people work 50 and some people work 30. So it really also is that yes, the board chair is going to be more work than not having a chair role, but a lot of it is also it's understanding, do you understand what a board is? Do you understand what it does? For me, it's putting it into perspective. So I know once the Hillsborough store opened and people were like, oh my gosh, who's making this decision? Have you been to a board meeting? When the Raleigh store opened, it was, well, where are these conversations happening? They're happening in the boardroom, and you can be in the boardroom. So a lot of it was that as well. Where do you want to be? And you are able to be there. So it really is, it's like any other system where you get to vote for who is going to be the next leader in the board role. And then, after a while, it became pretty easy, and I think also it feels like a heavy lift when you're like, oh, it's $500. It's also saying, okay, well, what's doable? How can we make this work? So the same way with just about anything else, we do have the payment plans to say you don't have to hand over $500 cash right here, but it really is. So what can we do in order to facilitate the process, both in the knowledge of why this is important, and then also, if it is a financial lift, how can we make that easier?
Yeah, I want to highlight something you just said there and brought up is that some people ask, well, $500 a share. Keep in mind, I just want to make sure that you keep in mind that, it's different every co-op. You get to structure it how you want. In this case, the workers get 50% of the dividends. And so the buy-in is a little higher to get 50% of the dividends versus thousands of owners, and a couple hundred, workers. So that something was brought up in the questions in the chat. So not the types of conversations, but you hinted at actual tools of communication, like that there might be a worker um, newsletter. I wondered if there's worker meetings. They're kind of asking how are board decisions communicated to the workers and the consumers, but to the owners in general. Like how is that made transparent to folks? What tools of communication are you guys using?
So within the board, it's the minutes. So the same, I would say you sit in a board meeting, the board has reviewed all of the documents. In the beginning of the meeting, you have the owner input, and then you're essentially as a spectator, you're watching the board kind of go through process and you hear it. So it's very, like you hear essentially what they're going through. You may have the GM report where the GM essentially gives a brief explanation and kind of different things like that. But many other documents, they're long, they're wordy, they're not super fun, they're not luxury reading, but you really kind of go through. And so that's when you're hearing the decisions. And then you can read them in the meeting or in the minutes. The following month, they're posted after the decision has been approved by the entire board, and kind of going through what we heard. This was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, but what we heard, especially from our worker owners, were we don't really understand. We don't understand what's happening in these meetings, and we don't understand how it applies to our work. So one of the things that I worked really hard with, and I'm pretty sure they still do it, but it's internally. So on Teams, within about a week after each board meeting, we essentially just write a synopsis. It's very brief. It's not intense on anything. So, we're not giving away any very specific information, but it's little things to say, kind of a while you were out. The GM spoke of the financial model and the holidays are coming up. So, turkeys will be coming in, and we really want everybody to make sure that you are looking at the new order form, just very basic things. And then also just kind of what the board is talking about. So if there was a financial plan, then, just a very brief, this is what's happening right now. Make sure you check in with your managers and they can go deeper into it. It was a one pager, very brief, because most people are reading this at work. So you don't have a lot of times on the sales floor, very brief, but we would also make everybody, all of our worker owners available to some capacity, not completely, but to some capacity where, so you might see something that kind of sparks your interest. So, if you're seeing something, you're like, well, how are we going to let people know? So especially, I mean, I bring up COVID so many times, but, we're talking about, hey, we're going to have these particular resources available. A lot of it was, okay, let's add this to the newsletter. So there was a very specific one pager that we would give to our worker owners to view after.
I think that part was all very exciting. I think it was to the person who asked the question and to myself is that a board meeting synopsis. So people know like we're talking about the potential of a second location and like so people know these big conversations are happening. But honestly, most of us aren't going to go read the board minutes, especially if we're a worker. We don't have time. So absolutely loved that piece. And I wanted to throw in, and they're not here to represent themselves, but I would say that I do want to say that those of us who are startups, we've had a couple startups, I think three that I know of for sure, that have opened with the bylaws for hybrid ownership, but have started with only consumer owners because they didn't have worker owners before they opened. And the only one has launched those worker ownership shares, and that's Gem City. Gem City had a nonprofit partner who had funding to invest in coming in and doing education and training for staff for multiple years. And somewhat, well, to invite them here, I put that on my list to talk about how they did that, how often. But there literally was staff, there were people who were being funded, not by the co-op, to come in and train folks about the cooperative model, ownership, worker ownership, what it would entail, what they would get out of it. And that took 2 years of work. So it was a combination of one, they kind of, as a startup, again, invest in what? I'm waiting to see if this thing's going to work,
Mhm.
right? And once everyone got a feeling, Gem City, oh, this thing's going to stick around and I really believe in what's going on here, there was more interest in worker ownership, is my understanding. And the other piece was people just needed it's not intuitive, what it means to own and what the responsibility is going to be and really what's the payback's going to be for me. And so that took time and investing in the staff learning what they and so I don't know how someone gets there, right? So I said principle 5 education. I don't know for a startup how folks, I think it's easier to see at Weaver Street, especially when you're like, well, my coworker got a $300 dividend last year,
Mhm.
like that answers itself.
Mhm.
I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I get that I'll get some of that money back right away, and then I have time to get curious about the rest. But I think it's particularly hard for startup employees who, they're building the business with you and waiting to see if it's going to work. And so I know that real investment was made on Gem City's part, and they're the only startup who's activated the worker class.
Well, and also I think that it's important, and I try to stress it, it's important to note things are so different in 40 years. So now everybody's on their phone and people are having much less
Mm.
in-person contact and things like that versus 40, 50 years ago when you're building a co-op and people are coming together and you're having those in-person conversations and people are hanging out and kind of just lazing around, it's a different conversation. So you're sitting around and you have volunteers and everybody's just loving what they're doing and they're saying, "Yeah, I'll buy in." But these days, when the world is moving so quickly, and you're thinking, I want to know right now. I mean, I want this to be very slot machine esque. So I'm not sure. If I put in right now, I don't know. I don't know what next year's going to be, and I don't know what tomorrow is going to be. So it's a lot of that conversation. It's curating that conversation, and exactly like you're saying, JQ, it's that conversation every day, and it's in the mode and in the speed that your workers are also going to understand. Because yes, you can make it, $100 or $200. It's going to depend on what your co-op is able to do, which is essentially why I put up 1988 is different from 2025. But as you're going through, it's also the constant conversation. And I know it's one thing I know just in my almost 20 years of working at Weaver Street, even the way that you communicate with your consumers and the way that you communicate with your overall community is going to change. So when you are saying, hey, you can also own this, would you own this? Ask that to your community as well. So when you're gauging your workers, does this seem like a place that you would want to be? Also get an idea of would you buy in and what would it take for you to buy in? Because even adding the 7 weeks of incentives, that was a conversation of what would be useful to you. So yeah, I'm one of the people that said a t-shirt. I will do a lot of things for a t-shirt. So yeah, this feels really great. I'll also say that it's fully refundable at any point as well. So when I did become a consumer owner and was no longer a worker owner, I did get my money back as well.
I wanted to ask you guys, we have time for one or two more questions. Please throw them in the chat. But since I don't have anyone else yet, I get to ask because I'm really curious about this, Alana. Something that I've run into with every consumer food co-op that is considered going hybrid and startups that talk about going hybrid, the consumer owners are actually really excited about the idea of worker ownership. And like, I was a GM of an established food co-op, quite large, and we explored worker ownership at the time the workers weren't super interested. But the owners were like, yeah, we've built this business for 40 years and stuff, but we'll happily sell you half of it for a couple, for a $500 share. Go for it. Like it, my experience is that the consumer owners say this manifests our values. We're excited about it. Do you find the consumer owners are excited about the hybrid worker co-op model and what do they find value in it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the many things that I think that consumer owners really loved was the treatment of our workers. When you walk into a Weaver Street Market, if you haven't already been, especially the Carver store, which I always rep because it's the first one, and it's the one that I worked in for so long, but it's an experience. So it's more than just a grocery store. And it meant a lot, especially through hard times and knowing, grocery workers are deemed essential when you want them to be essential, but also knowing when you speak to our workers, when you walk in, you're talking to genuinely happy people. So, it's not kind of this idea of make sure that you're super happy. Yeah, you have your moments, but a lot of our consumers really appreciated the fact that our workers were genuinely happy. And that the financial model and essentially ensured that our workers were taken care of. So it made sure that we were paying a living wage more than a minimum wage. It made sure that we were providing full benefits and even part time, things that a lot of times you aren't able to do. So it also made sense to a lot of the finances of it and understanding, oh, this model is looking out for people in a way that even people outside of the retail industry are usually not receiving, especially not in a space where they feel comfortable. So we did have a lot of consumer buy-in when people were very excited. They're like, okay, you're paying your people well, you're treating them well, and you're allowing for your workers to own this in the same way that we're owning this as your outside consumers. Yeah, it was a really good, it's a feel good moment overall. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that I found that is very much the truth because as consumer owners, those checks are never going to be big. And so you're there for the values. And most have been super hurrah, hurrah about worker ownership. So that's been a perk, not a problem in their minds. So we have one more question, but it's a big can of worms questions, and we have 2 minutes. Uh, so Julia, good question. It's about, what people can vote on. And yes, you can vote for your board of directors. And in worker co-ops, there's all different models of how much direct control the workers have, which usually varies on the size of the co-op, to be completely honest. So the bigger the co-op gets, the more worker owners there are. You see more consumer owner-like structures where you mostly vote for the board of directors and the bylaws. So it is different by food co-op. There are some co-ops where you can vote on things more than the board directors and bylaws as always, and sometimes there are a few additional things. So I am going to turn that over to Alana to ask if that's different in her co-op, what if there's anything else folks can vote at, but know that it is different co-op by co-op, and you see this model of mostly board and bylaw ownership when the owner base, whether it's worker or consumer, is large. So I'm going to turn that over to Lana. Can people vote on anything in addition to the board, who's on the board, and bylaws?
No, you're exactly right. So essentially the larger you get, kind of the less there is to vote on kind of very specifically. But I will say one of the things that I think has shifted in a lot of ways is it's you're you're an owner, but there's still a very strict attention to your worker class. So you have your worker owners, but you have your worker class. So I've heard, and I was also the same way. I heard quite a bit of, I know that they're not an owner, but they still have things to say. So, listening to these are our worker owners, and yes, you can come to co-op meetings, and we have owner specific events, but even in the larger frame of it, it is. But what about these other people? Because this is my coworker, and I really love working with them, and I'm not sure why they're an owner, but we want to make sure that they exist. So, that's a lot of what we found. The larger you get, the harder it is. And it is more, what do you vote for on the board? And then it is also, when admin comes in and says, what about our product set and what about different consumer feedback and things like that? It becomes kind of just a very, well, we're all here together, and which also makes it easier for, why are we not all just owners? So yeah, it worked in our favor in the large sense. Oh, JQ, you're on mute.
I'm going to wrap this up because I always wrap us up on time. Allanah has agreed to stay a few minutes after. So if you want to be able to unmute and ask some more questions, just wait till we wrap up the video and you can stay and talk a little bit longer. But I want to really quickly want to thank Allanah for her time with us tonight and say that we just sent you an email. It is a 2-minute survey. We can keep these sessions free if people will give us feedback. It helps us make these FCI live series better, better and better and better, which we think we hear from you guys we do pretty well. And it's because we listen to you and we actually do what you say and we work with speakers that you say are really effective. So please tell us that. And also, it helps us know, let our sponsors know and our grantors know that we're actually effectively delivering what they want delivered when they can hear what you thought about what we delivered. So if you could just take 2 minutes and help us keep FCI Live free by answering the survey about this session, we'd really appreciate that. We have coming up tomorrow effective community outreach. It's going to be facilitated by Bonnie Hudspeth of the Firebrand Co-op, but we're really excited. The Bronzeville Food Co-op organizing team is going to come and talk about what kind of community outreach really worked for them in stage 1 and got them cooking with gas and really moving fast in stage 1 with their community. And then tomorrow, not as exciting a topic, but I'll be joining you to talk about timelines, both your internal planning timelines and then what you communicate to the community and owners so they can follow along without overwhelming them. So, and there's, of course, we have much more coming up tomorrow and Thursday, and then all of next week, Monday through Thursday, we have more sessions. Please go check them out at our website. And last but not least, we have a record number of sponsors of FCI Live 2025 this year that are making this possible. Thank you guys so much for the vote of confidence in the startup food co-op movement and its importance. These organizations are every day supporting startup food co-ops and making it possible. So thank you to them. And with that, we are going to wrap up the session.